use the PSAT or SAT to qualify. The science test doesn't, it doesn't have a purpose like the others.
Yes.
So I think that's the difference at that high school.
It's not perceived as important in terms of those students who are going on to a 2 or 4 year college or university, especially if a student has to put his or her focus on hitting that appropriate score to be a national merit recognized or finalist. Chances are in our communication with our student advisory group that the student is going to put more time into that PSAT than a traditional science test. But again, I don't want to discount the opt-out movement that has come across the entire country as well. And thirdly, we're really testing kids a whole lot more than what we should be testing as well.
All right, without further ado, I'm going to turn this into the bigger data dive, which is the performance framework itself. And really what I'm hoping to have is just an inquiry process as we move along. And I've got 5 hours, is that right? I've got 5 hours to go through all this?
Give or take a few.
Okay, all right.
Careful.
So, he will 5 hours. Well, and I've got plenty of data for us to peruse tonight, so I'm going to keep an eye on our time. But I want to start with the front page. So the front page of this document, it's in front of you and it's also up on the projection. Those charts are what you just saw in the presentation, but it's in a nice overall format. The one piece I do want to call attention to is the color. What color do you generally see on this thing?
Green.
Green, and green is good. And so that's a good thing. We don't have, we're not in a yellow, orange, or red category. Really across most of the metrics, aside for the one metric under high school. And we'll talk about that one a little bit more specific here in just a minute as to why that is yellow. I do want to give you a little bit of time just to look at it before we move on. So I'll give you a few minutes to look at that first page. And then we'll start diving into the page after that, in case you have any questions. Oh, it's only one page.
We're gleaning the handout. Just want to check in with you. Do you have any questions? Are you doing okay?
I'm pulling into the parking lot.
Okay, we'll see you then shortly. All right,
Yeah, thank you.
thank you. So Tammy, we can go ahead and hang up on Chancho Shore. She's on her way upstairs.
So Matt, post-secondary workforce is only high school.
Yes.
So middle school and elementary, they just use the other two
Yes.
categories.
Close. The state's accountability system is more in favor of growth than achievement. So in elementary and middle, the ratio is 60-40. 60% growth, 40% achievement. When you get to high school, they add post-secondary workforce readiness, and it's the ratio that you see in front of you, which is 30, 40, and 30. They still have growth as being the one that's weighted the most. Now, there's going to be some changes with elementary and middle in future years where they add another indicator, which is another achievement indicator. It's called growth to standard. We're waiting to see what the technical specs on that look like, but we know that's going to have an impact on our schools as well. Thus, another change that we have to deal with. So we'll deal with that when we get there.
Matt, would you spend a little time as Director Chancho Shore is on the way? And I know she understands the distinction between the two, growth versus achievement.
Perfect. academic achievement, as measured on the school performance framework and the district performance framework, is the average score that kids get on any of the assessments that are in front of them. They use the mean scale score to say, here's how a kid did. The scale could be from up to 800 or up to 650, depending on whatever test it is. It's whatever that average score is. That's what is used to determine your colors on this. It's not proficiency, but it's your average score. So when you look at your performance framework, it doesn't tell you how many kids are proficient. It just tells you what your average score is. And they measure your average score against the initial data set for the test. So like for CMAS, they go back to 2016. So, and we'll look at the cut scores on the next page. Growth is a measure of student to student. It's not a year's growth in a year's time. It's how are kids performing against their academic peers. So it's not their demographics. In other words, it's not minority students compared to minority students. It's students who have the same score history. So if I score a 700 one year, Erica also scores a 700. Our scores the next year will be compared to one another, and our growth will be in comparison to each other. And that's how growth is measured. So it's not a year's growth in a year's time, it's how we're compared to each other with similar score histories, which is really important, a big distinction. Many of our assessments in our system are a year's growth in a year's time, but Colorado's model is an academic measure. Any other questions with the first page? Any categories, anything on there that raises questions for you?
Maybe you could talk a little bit about how our schools measure post-secondary and workforce readiness.
Perfect, great question. So in this model, post-secondary workforce readiness, they look at a standard set of indicators across all schools. The first is SAT, and they have SAT broken up between evidence-based reading and writing and math. That's one category. Dropout is a second category. Graduation rates is a third. And you also have matriculation rates, which is a measure of what students are doing after high school. All of those indicators come together to form one score on post-secondary workforce readiness. And we'll dive into that a little bit more because that has changed from last year to this year, which impacted our data.
And Matt, speaking of change, we see this is the district level framework. Looking at the line, not the individual school or building level frameworks. We scored 66.9 points out of 100, which put us in a performance. Can you talk a little bit about how our, I want to be kind here, our State Department of Education and other folks have decided that we're going to change this framework and make reaching these various levels more difficult by so-called strengthening the standards?
Great question. So with schools, this last fall, the State Board of Education made a different determination on how schools are scored. Currently, on the right, the cut score for schools to be green or to be performance is 53%. That's the cut for schools. For districts, it's a different scoring system because we have different categories. But for schools, that cut score is 53. They had a set of hearings this last fall, and we gave them plenty of feedback on this subject. They determined that they wanted to raise that cut score from 53 to 61. So they've increased that score for schools between improvement and performance, thereby making it more difficult for schools to attain that top level. Interestingly enough, that's the only cut score that they did change. So they made it more difficult to go from your improvement to your performance. And we gave them plenty of feedback to all that would listen as to why would you want to make a change to this system. You know, the system is working currently. We're trying to figure out how to support our schools. Why change that? The perspective, and Dr. Tucker, you can speak to this as well, is that when they look at the performance results of our students for just achievement, and they look at the performance of schools on the framework, it's not one-to-one because of growth. The growth is factored higher, and so when they look at those two data sets, that's the most difficult for them to look at, is if you look at the achievement and school performance, they don't align. And so by increasing the point value, they're making those two more aligned.
And we don't have any problems with accountability. As you all know, we have the local area superintendents association, the Douglas County group, then the group outside of Douglas County superintendents. And we stated that we're not adverse to accountability, but we're worried about the changes, changing the framework at the same time we're renewing curriculum. And we know when there's a new curriculum adoption, achievement drops. So why hit schools with a double whammy? State is changing the curriculum and increasing the point value in order for students to be ranked in one of these categories here to the far right.
Any other questions with the first page?
Yeah, so when a parent's picking up this to look at the district performance, we have a district of choice. So we have different type of school. We have 21 charter school and 70 neighborhood school. So this district score does include every type of the school, including all the charter school and Hope 9 also.
Yes, it's any of the schools that we authorize are part of this data set.
So including Hope 9.
Yes. Yep, this includes Hope and any of our charter schools as well.
It was that one school that we didn't have sufficient data on.
So except EDCSD, right?
EDCSD's individual data doesn't show up, but those kids are added as part of our district level data set.
Okay.
So that count is added, but they don't have enough for their individual school to get a score, and so they end up with insufficient data.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the individual school scores would be, they're on the same scale as, it's the same numbers. So our lowest school, like what's the range? If 66.9 is kind of the average for the district, what would like the range look like for schools?
So there's two filters. The individual school filter, they run their data individually through their own metrics. Then we take all of the data and run it through the district performance framework. So the individual school performance framework scores don't average to our district. They take all of the data and put it through a different scale and a different metric in order to get these scores. And the cut scores on the side are different between district and schools. And so all of the data is included for every school for creating the district, and schools have their own metrics that are
It just doesn't
associated with it.
translate like time.
Yes, yeah, great question. Okay, I would like to turn our attention to page 2. And I'll give you a minute. These get busy in a hurry, but I want to give you some time so you can ask some questions. So I'm going to give you a minute or two just to look. And I'm primarily going to focus in on achievement first and then work to growth. I'm going to go big picture first. What do you notice about color? All right, that's great. Very good. We have more variations in color. We've also added some subgroups. And for performance frameworks, these 4 subgroups are the subgroups that they disaggregate on every one of the indicators. It's English learners, free and reduced lunch eligible, minority, and students with disabilities. That's part of the federal accountability system. These subgroups historically underperform. Therefore, as part of being an accountability system, we're held accountable to monitoring these subgroups because historically speaking, they have underperformed. So that's why these 4 are on there. Other subgroups, I mean, there's tons of subgroups that are out there, like GT, for example. That's not considered as part of our accountability framework currently because historically speaking, they don't underperform. And so these groups, historically speaking, underperform.
Do they not underperform? I
What?
mean, really? If you look at growth, I don't know. Is that an assumption that they don't underperform?
Strictly from an achievement standpoint. With growth, you can see that there's a lot more green down there because it's an academic peer metric.
Are there other groups that are not listed that we feel like we should be?
Well, I don't know where Colorado is in relation to the federal government, looking at the end size, that may come into play here, is that right?
Absolutely. Our end size limitation is 16, so anything below 16. When we look at the data, we disaggregate beyond this. We're interested in if, like minority students, what's the breakdown of those groups? With, free and reduced lunch, which students are free, which ones are reduced? English language learners, we're interested in knowing what language is the primary language. So we disaggregate the data beyond what's listed for accountability purposes, but for accountability purposes, they cluster those kids as one group, and that's what we examine on this level.
How about GT student? Do they break it out for the GT student?
For accountability purposes, they do not. And
But do
that's-
we?
We do, yes. As part of our reporting for the UIP and as part of Natasha's work, she and I spent a whole lot of time together looking at data for that.
The state, Kevin, the state does it primarily because the federal government, under ESSA, doesn't require them to do it. It's one of the, some states break this down by I hate to use the term, I'm gonna say groups, not subgroups, but across the country, they say subgroups. And if it's not one of them, which we have to federally disaggregate the data.
Columns, as you work from left to right, the first is the count. That's how many records that were included as the calculation. The participation rate that you see here, that's the federal accountability participation. That's the raw number of students available versus how many is tested. The next is your mean scale score. That's your average. The average is based on the assessment, and each assessment for ELA and math has the same scale. For science, it's on a different scale. So when you see that 600 value, don't get panicked. They're on a different scale of scoring than CMAS for ELA and math. The next column over is percentile rank. What they do is they look at the mean scale score and they compare it to the 2016 data. And they say, this average score, where would that put us at in relation to that 2016 data? And they assign a percentile rank for that average. So it's not telling us that out of the entire state we're at the 80th percentile. It's saying your average score as compared to 2016 would put you at the 80th percentile. They always anchor back at that first year of benchmark data as the starting point. And they sometimes do recenter that, but they anchor on that data point. The next column over is the point value. It's points eligible versus earned. That's their accountability system of saying for all students, for example, under English language arts, there are 8 points available. We meet, so we get 6 points out of 8. Your subgroups are, the n size is smaller, therefore your point values are smaller. So instead of being out of 8 points, English language learners are 1 point on your performance framework. So they disaggregate not only the students, but also the point values to reflect the smaller n size.
So do we do any study to see why the participation rate of the student with a disability are at least 10 percentage point lower than the rest of the group?
Yeah, these are, we examined a lot in terms of, what's happening with each of these groups. And what we found is there's such variations as to why parents are excusing. It's very difficult for us to ascertain one specific reason. In a subcategory of all, they do not want to have their kids test because they have test anxiety. Other groups do not want to have their data shared with the state, so they don't test. Others don't see the value of the assessment, so they don't test. So the reasons for excusing vary to the student. It's interesting.
Same pattern as the other school district in the Metro Denver area or the state FH? I mean, because to me, I'm just looking at raw data, a 1 year raw data without any comparison to the state FH or the Metro Denver FH. It does not mean anything to me because it's just a number in there. So are we basically in line with the state FH or the Metro Denver area FH, or are we some sort of outlier? I mean, that myself give me a much better information than, okay, this is a data point in here with no reference to anything.
And historically speaking, our participation rate is slightly lower than other districts. We have more excusals in Douglas County than in other districts. Boulder is something that has a similar participation rate as ours. Other schools, and I actually have this data for you to look at to see that comparison of what that participation rate, how it compares to other districts. So that's something I can share with you here in just a few minutes.
Yeah, I'll be interested. And what can the board help to improve this? I mean, the participation rate, I mean, what can we do to help?
Well, I think you guys did the first amazing step, and I was just talking to President Ray about this earlier, is you passed a resolution to undo the previous resolution that said that this data doesn't matter. And that's still residual within our student population. Some students have grown up only opting out because, they grew up in our system when the resolution was still in play and when excusals were the thing. So some kids take their very first test at 11th grade. Like they've never taken an assessment up to that point, but that one has a value, so they take that one.
This has been going on for a while.
Yes.
I mean, when I was chair at Thunder Ridge, it was such a heated debate, trying to talk to the community about the value of taking the exam and honoring the parents' right to opt out, but having an open conversation around that. And I think the SACs can play a really important role in this. And they need to probably be equipped with the right way to have that conversation because it is a really heated debate among some folks.
Is this something that we could give to DAC, as some of the goal for them to do the outreach?
I'm going to shift a little bit. Good ideas. Does not meet is glaring at us with students with disabilities. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so let's talk about how that number over there in the rating is generated. So the mean scale score determines what color of rating that you get. And the mean scale score, cut scores, are the same regardless of what group you're part of. And so as you interpret the results for what we see on the very far right, the mean scale score in the center determines what color you have on the right. So if you look at students with disabilities, for example, in English language arts, their mean scale score is 713.1, which if you compare that to the cut scores across all students, would put them in the does not meet category. This is a category with students with disability Nancy and I have conversations with over the time that we've been here. I will say that score has improved over the last couple of years, and I'll show you that data. It's not near where we want it to be. When I look at this, my eyes automatically gravitate towards those red categories. And then, the yellow ones are something that do make me cause pause as well. I love green. Green is good. And so we do look at that sample, and we do look at that data set to say, okay, this does not meet category. What does it mean? But the one thing I will say is because of the way the framework is set up, I don't interpret achievement without growth. Both are at play, that your achievement data matters and your growth matters. And in the state's eyes, growth actually matters more than achievement. So when we look at performance of students with disabilities, we see the achievement is in the red category, but as we go down to growth, we see that under growth, they're approaching. And they're very close to hitting the cut score, which is 50 on the percentile, to move them into the green category. So I always interpret that data in concert with one another, just as the state intends us to do with these performance frameworks.
And the ratio is 55, growth is 35?
In this case, it's 60-40.
60-40. And that's one of the areas that the Denver area metro superintendents were able to lobby the state with, because many state wanted to put more on achievement, put more value on achievement than growth. And that's where we really need the community's help, and especially the board's help, to continue to have a greater emphasis on academic growth. All students don't start out at the starting line with the same level of skills and abilities. I do appreciate the state has multiple categories with the ratings. It has approaching, has, meeting. We certainly don't like does not meet, but it does have an approaching and meets. In some accountability systems, you're either proficient or you're not. So I do like that, but I can see in the near future that you'll see more emphasis on achievement, which is an event, a one-time test, over looking at how students have grown, as Matt stated earlier, over an entire year.
So I'm going to move down to growth, the growth metric that's down there. What do you notice about color down here?
More green.
Much more green.
Much more green. So our kids are, in comparison to their academic peers, are growing, which is wonderful. I mean, that's, we always take these two things in concert with one another. Achievement tells us, yes, they have the knowledge and skills to meet grade level expectation. This tells us that they're growing in relation to their academic peers. The thing about the growth category for Colorado is you have an equal opportunity for growth regardless of how you perform. So if you're exceeding expectations on the test, you have an equal opportunity to grow just as much as someone who may not be meeting the standards. So it does level the playing field because you're being compared to your academic peers, which is an important, really celebration for our district, in that even in these subcategories, which historically do not perform well, they're growing at meeting the expectation. And some of them are heartbreakingly close to being green. If you look at all students for ELA, we're at approaching. The cut median growth percentile for that is 50. We're at 49. So we are on the cusp of making that green as well. So the metric that to keep in mind for median growth percentile is 50. 50 makes you green. So as you interpret the color of green, that cut of 50 is really, really important. The larger your data set, you regress more and more towards that middle. And so for us to have metrics that are above that 50 is really, really, really good. Yes?
So in every school has a performance framework, so we be able to see every school where students with disabilities do not meet.
Yes.
We would also be able to see every school where they're approaching or meets. So as we are looking at budgets, we're also looking at providing additional supports for the schools that do not meet for students with disabilities in a different fashion than the ones that have students who are approaching or meets.
So and that's why the board's investment in professional development has been so great. Just think about 2 years ago, our folks that we had in the professional development department would come to the board members individually and say, hey, we need this amount of money. And so the board's a consistent investment over the last 2 years in PD is huge. The PD that accompanies any new curricular items must be high quality to especially address those buildings where students are not meeting this particular framework. of a certain of meeting the metric here.
When we're looking at how we are supporting schools that have different needs, students with more English language learners or more disabilities, this is another point of data for us to be able to put our finger on to say, here's why we would give different monies to this school and not to necessarily the other school.
The importance again of the board with this last meal cycle in November 2018, providing dollars for our highly impacted schools.
Do we have a number of schools that, can you give me a number of schools that had students with disabilities does not meet? So is it our majority of our schools have students with disabilities does not meet? Half? Kind of what's the barometer there?
Across one subject or multiple? I'd have to do some digging. to
So
get
how
that.
about just students with disabilities for English language and math?
Well, and I would say historically speaking, and not just Douglas County, but across the board, that generally speaking, in that category of students with disabilities, it is lower typically and does not meet.
I would agree, and I would want to know kind of where our measurement is. So I know across the board in Colorado that's the case, given it's one test, one moment in time, one kind of assessment that maybe students with disabilities might not have as an easy time with. But I'd like to know if we have, are we alike like districts? Are we different? Like, do we have more schools with more does not meets with students with disabilities or less? And where is that measurement kind of land?
So for students with disability, there's another framework that they use, which is called administrative units, which looks at students with disabilities and disaggregates that data even more. And that way you can see a window because they acknowledge that this assessment may not be measuring accurately for these students. And so they have these additional metrics that they use that disaggregate that data even more. And that's information that I can get you that you would be able to see more clearly, not just on this one-time metric, but other metrics associated with students with disabilities. Administrative units is a far better way for us to do that, and I would be, that's something that we can certainly produce. I can touch base with Nancy on that.
Well, I would tell you the reason that I would be wondering about it is, I know this is one measurement, one data point, one moment in time, but it gives you trends and it gives you important information. So if we consistently have a school that does not meet at a really low level, and then we have other schools that meet or are approaching at a high level, we can use some of that information while we're collecting data about what works. This is working, and here's even another point of data, another piece of evidence that shows that this kind of programming that happens at such and such a school is working.
And one of the pieces I'm going to give you in just a minute is going to be the trend data for this performance framework over time. And you can see what, not just the rating, you can actually see what the mean scale score is to give you a sense of, are we moving students in the right direction regardless of rating? And I'll be able to share that with you in just a minute so you can really dive into any and all of these, including all students or subgroups, to see, are we progressing in the right manner? I used this analogy this morning that our organization is like an aircraft carrier. We have momentum to continue going the path that we're going, and to turn is very difficult. So anytime that we see a progressive increase in our average score, that shows that we're making progress. And so I get excited when I see an updated score. So I'll share that data with you so you can see across the board, not just the school level, but we're looking specifically at the district level data to see how are we progressing with moving students along with our other students. So you can see all versus your subgroups as well.
There's a big discussion, and I wonder where it landed, maybe the academic growth, as you were referring to, is not necessarily going to be continued as a point
Right.
of
And
data.
that's where we need the board's help and the community help, because there is a very aggressive and, in my kind opinion, draconian effort to get rid of that. And to me, growth is more important than achievement. Not to say that I don't value achievement, it's important too. And we will embrace achievement But I can tell you from being in other places, that's a recipe to really, really give our schools across Colorado a serious black eye.
So you'll keep us up to date about how we can continue to
Yeah.
support that this is a good measurement.
Yes.
And then my other just question related to this specifically is, the conversation at the state board was that there would have to be 2 years. You have to maintain your performance rate for 2 years before it could be a literal standing. Did that pass, and did we acquire a 2-year rating at this point?
So the state issues a 1-year, which is their primary way of doing state accountability. They also issue a 3-year metric that allows us, it's another framework that just says multi-year on it. And that's primarily used for federal accountability systems. So they issue actually both, so you can have a lens. And what they do with the multi-year is they take 3 years worth of data and they run it through the same cut scores and the same processes to generate new metrics based on 3 years worth of data as opposed to 1.
So we're at performance as a school district?
Yes.
And then our schools that went from priority improvement to performance, if they go back to priority improvement, do they go back on the clock immediately and lose the performance year?
Yes.
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 So they do lose the 1 performance year. Did that pass?
And so from an accountability standpoint, as soon as you drop below that threshold, you're on watch.
Thank you.
10 minutes, Matt, for DPF before we want to move on into some math kind of data. Is that?
Yep, that's perfect.
All right.
I'm going to turn our attention to high school. This is where the major changes occurred between last year and this year. So I'm on the page that's associated with growth and achievement for high school. I want to draw your attention to science. As you may recall, if you look at color, what do you notice about color on the high school?
It's not green.
Majority of them red.
Yeah, there's a lot of red. And when you look at science specifically,
It's all red.
science specifically is red. Now, draw your attention to that column for participation. We have talked about this internally, that our performance has been based largely on 20% of our kids. And this data set is no different. For all of our students, 20% of our kids are determining our overall rating. And this is the first year that our rating is not meets. It went to approaching. But again, it's 20% of our students. And so that's been a very, very active conversation with our high schools. Because as you can imagine, individually, they are impacted by the low participation as well. And it's the risk that you take when you only have 20% of your kids taking the test. Who's taking the test, and how dedicated are they when they take that test? 1 of every 5 kids is in a room taking a test. That's going to have an impact. And this is the first year that we actually see it on our performance framework.
The school districts that surround us, do they have the same concern and are experiencing the same kind of information that we are?
Same concern, but the participation rate is not as low. Okay?
Yeah. Last thing, we're happy that the district and the state moved towards the PSAT. We pay for that for our kids. The negative thing about that, there's no science component to that. The PSAT, again, when kids are taking what I call all the marbles for college scholarships, they'll take the reading and writing, the ELA, and the math. There's no science component.
Right.
That's probably the best selling point we can make for our juniors to take the science CMAS test. Because if they don't take anything, obviously if they take the SAT, there's a science component to the SAT and the ACT. But many of them may not take that again until their senior year.
So, did you want to go first? I think maybe tying it to the importance of STEM, because that really resonates with the community, the importance of science, technology, engineering, and math, and this being one of the only data points that we have. Could help break through to some of the reticence for taking it, so.
How much time does that test take out of a student's day, the science test?
Approximately 4 hours.
So as a parent of recently graduated high school students, I'm wondering if also it might help at our school level. Because I think in my experience, some of the students who opt out are students who are also in AP classes most of our students have really heavy class schedules. I know that, time is sometimes scarce for our high school students. They're involved in a lot of activities, they're trying to achieve, they're concerned about their SAT. So I think from the student perspective, they sometimes look at that 4 hours and go, I've got all this other stuff, and I think they're making that choice. So I'm wondering if there's, and I don't know the answer to this, but I'm wondering if there's something we could do at our high school level to somehow give them a bit of breathing room to encourage them to use that 4 hours that way.
So one of the things that we can do, and we'll explore this more next year, is you can apply to have an early administrative window for science. Because the timing of this, you actually hit the nail right on the head, is you've got SAT testing, but you also have AP and IB testing right around the corner, if not during the same time. So one of the things that we're going to explore next year is possibly moving the science test to earlier, so it's out of that stress window of all of these other accountability metrics in the end of the year, if that would improve our participation. And that's a conversation we're going to have with our high school principals.
I think that's a great idea. I do think it makes an impact, the timing.
Have we had that conversation with the student advisory group?
Yeah, they're on my list.
Okay.
They're on my list. I actually have a meeting with them coming, in 2 weeks? I have a conversation with them.
We spoke to them before, though, just in a general fashion, that they don't see purpose for this assessment. I mean, they really don't see
Yes.
who's going to use this and for my benefit, and so
And
therefore.
what is that balance of how to use my 4 hours?
Yeah, so our student advisory group were just like that they don't see the meaning or the purpose, so because of that, we just can't incentivize and say, we'll give you a piece of candy if you take this test. We need to bring
Yeah,
some
but
purpose and meaning.
the other surrounding school district, I think LPS probably is very high in terms of participations, right? Or Cherry Creek. Do we look at the other school district that has much higher participation rate than we are, and try to borrow some method or learn some lesson from them to see how we could improve and do similar things?
Yes, I'm not afraid to call any district out there and brainstorm some ideas. So,
Thank you. I think that I'm excited that you guys are considering that.
yeah, I think it might have an impact, but we'll see. We'll see what it does. I'm going to draw your attention to growth. They did make one change that did have an impact on our scores. Previous years, they included growth from 8th grade students to 9th grade students for English language arts. They did not do that this year, and it lowered our scores because our kids, they grow great. And so the removal of that data set, which is why the count is so different. You see that for all students it's 8,200 for evidence-based reading and writing, but for math it's 11,000. They removed that 8th to 9th grade group of kids. And the reasoning that they provided is the constructs between the two tests are so different. CMAS requires writing, PSAT does not. And so they felt it measured two different things. And so to do that kind of growth calculation, they didn't think that it was valid. And so the removal of that data did have an impact on our ratings for that growth category. The next page is the post-secondary. This would answer your question about what's included. This was also changed for this year. The evidence-based reading and writing and math, previous years, they did not include the disaggregated data as part of the scoring. They did this year. And so they included the subgroup scores for those students. And in those categories, our students did not perform as well. And so therefore, it lowered our point value for that. You'll see that at dropout rate, they have the scoring, but they did not include it under matriculation yet. You see the blanks in there? At some point, they're going to include that metric as well. But including the subgroups under evidence-based reading and writing and math did have a negative impact on our scoring. So those three things had a major impact on not only us, but almost 70% of the districts around the state saw a reduction in their high school math scoring because of all three of those things. So just a point of reference.
Just to clarify, this happened at the same time that I think our dropout rate decreased a bit. Can you just mention that?
Yeah, those numbers that I just sent via memo will be included in next year's performance
Last
framework.
year. Okay.
Yeah, they're about 18 months behind. So with that data, another interesting timeline thing that we have. So I'm going to turn our attention to the math conversations.
In regards to graduation, to add that.
Oh, yes. So one of the things that's going to be added to graduation, starting with the class of next year, their seniors, is in order for those students to graduate, another requirement from the state has been added that they have to show competence in one of the menu of options, whether it's SAT, ASVAB, concurrent enrollment, IB, there's industry certificates, there's a capstone, there's all of these different things. That next year will have an impact on our graduation data because we're adding another requirement from the state in order for those kids to graduate. That's a data set that we've been monitoring for several years, and we're working with schools right now to see the overall impact of adding another requirement. I mean, logically, if you add another requirement for someone, it would make it more difficult. And so that's the concern, is by adding another thing for students to have to do from the state's level, it's going to impact our graduation, and that'll be data that I'll be informing you about next year for sure, throughout the year, as this is what we're monitoring, because next year's seniors are the first year that have that additional requirement.
This is the new high school requirements that
It is.
are kicking in.
Yep.
Right? And the menu that we are providing, do we feel like we've adequately communicated that to the public? Are we worried at all that it's going to surprise anyone? And then lastly, when looking at our subgroups here, are there groups that we're concerned about with the new requirements?
So yes, yes, and yes. I'm concerned anytime you bring a new requirement on board that you can never, ever communicate enough. I mean, we've dedicated a web page just to graduation and graduation competencies. That's available on our website. We provide templates for schools in order for them to communicate. We send information out. You can never communicate enough for this. The best communication always occurs at the school and individual student level. And so working with high school counselors to make sure that information is getting into the hands of students and parents is critical. But I mean, I'm going to be really, really frank with you on this, is I'm concerned because you're adding another requirement. Adding another requirement, there's no way that it's not going to have a negative impact. And so I'm concerned.
And how do we help our people understand whether that this is a requirement, not another option or pathway for graduation? A lot of states are seeing industry certificates and the ASVAB as an additional pathway towards graduation, which should help students. I mean, how do we help folks understand those two?
Well, what we've done is we've put out information that's lays out the different 4 requirements for graduation, which for us in Douglas County are the credits. You've got community service, you have your individual career plan, your ICAP, and now this 4th state level requirement. So we put it out and it's laid out in policy as those 4 things. All 4 of those things have to be aligned in order for a student to graduate. We have been working with high school principals for the last several years of looking at the data. And to your point, I mean, we've been disaggregating this data down to figuring out what specific students need which of these menu of options. The great thing is your all approval of the entire menu. That's tremendous because the more opportunities we give kids, the better. Because now instead of just having one option, which like the SAT, we're giving them industry certificates, a capstone project, an ASVAB, so you have multiple opportunities. So we've been developing some data tools associated with Infinite Campus that allows them to see their student population in terms of which students are being successful on these competencies, which students are approaching these competencies, and also using data like PSAT that leads into the SAT as a way to monitor those students as they get close to the SAT, which is the one that matters in terms of graduation.
And another shout out to the board, when you made an emphasis for us and provided funding to increase our career technical education offerings. We know those numbers have grown tremendously. Approximately 3,000 students, students will save over $3 million by participating in our concurrent enrollment program. By being in our concurrent enrollment program and taking CTE options, that will lead them to receiving industry certificates as well.
One other question, if you were to lay out and aggregate the data for our school performance frameworks by feeder, would you see significant differences in how schools performed?
We can look at that and see how different feeder systems work together in terms of performance. Are you thinking in terms of the vertical articulation or just elementary to elementary, middle to middle, and high?
I'm thinking of zip code to zip code.
Oh, zip code to zip code?
So do you see a big difference in school performance frameworks in Castle Rock
Yes.
versus Highlands Ranch? And as we're discussing equity and thinking about it, and sorry for the use of that word once again, I use a different one, but I can't think of a better one. That is a keynote piece of data for us to remember to consider when we're thinking about budget, when we're thinking about highly impacted, the zip code inequity that happens just because it's where our kids come in and what we are able to prepare for them has to look different.
Yes.
And I like that also it gets to time on task. Ted, your group is working with Eric and Marlena to ensure we have uniformity of belts now in a time on task. Correct? We are. Across the regions.
Okay, I had a request, I'm not sure what day it was, to generate some additional data for you that's not related to the district performance framework. This data is related to the similar source, which is CMAS data, but we're looking at this data a little bit differently. This is in the performance framework, we're looking at averages. Now we're shifting our attention to performance levels for individual students as to whether there does not meet, partially meets, approach, met, and exceeds. So it's disaggregating that data differently. And it's starting with third grade and it goes all the way through eighth grade in this packet. The request here is really about looking for patterns in performance. Now, in this test, which is CMAS, the level of disaggregated data that we get on an item analysis standpoint is very limited. It's not down to the question in terms of saying X% of kids are getting this question right or wrong. They get us down to, at the bottom, the sub-score level, which is the bottom lower left corner of each one of these pages. This shows how our students are performing on the different sub-scores of tests. Now, as you look through this, you're going to see a pattern of behavior on those 4 bars, the 2 that are blue and the 2 that are red. And you'll see it across different levels from 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. You'll see a general pattern of performance.
I don't see the grade levels. Am I missing it somewhere?
The grade level is on the top, so the first page is 3rd grade.
Kind of encrypted, Bruce, so they have like the subtitle, it says 03 up there.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
And so,
Oh, third.
yep, all of these are 3rd grade.
Okay.
And then the next page would be 4th
Thank
grade.
you.
Yep.
Okay. It's like, I don't see it either.
What is that?
Yeah.
So, the pattern, as you see it, which 2 categories are the lowest as you look at it? And we can start with 3rd grade.
Math expression, reasoning, and math models.
Yes, and that pattern is consistent across the board, that math expression, your expression of reasoning, and mathematical modeling are 2 that score, generally speaking, the lowest across. And they are by far the most difficult thing on this test. Students are not just required to give a right answer. They have to be able to explain why they're getting that right answer. In addition, they also have to use different techniques to model. So instead of doing a problem where it's 7 times 3 gives you 21, they have to be able to model 7 times 3 in a variety of different situations. So it's not the same test that you and I took as kids in terms of like basic skills test. This test is very difficult because it's asking kids to express themselves and their answers. It's asking them to explain. It's more aligned with our Common Core expectations or our state level expectations of standards, which changed, if you go back to the slide earlier, back in 2008-9 when we adopted new standards. We adopted Common Core state standards and aligned them in our state. And that changed the expectations for what we have for kids. And I say this a lot in every meeting that I go to. The expectations of state standards now is far different than what it was pre-2009. We're asking more of our kids. Therefore, the test is asking more of the kids. And not only that, but it's asking them to do it in a very specific environment. It's no longer a paper pencil test. It's now in a computer where they have active simulations, they have drag and drop, they have to type their answers out. It is a far more difficult test, which is why these 2 middle categories typically are your low categories, because that's the written expression of their understanding, their ability to model in novel situations with the content. It's a very difficult test. One of the activities I'd love to do if we had a future work session is actually have you guys take
I was
part of
gonna
that
say,
test.
have you ever tried to take the test?
Yes.
I mean, it's amazingly difficult to take.
Yes.
It's amazing that kids can perform on it at all. And then the curriculum alignment with what kids are expected to do by grade level is interesting also. And the standards they're being judged by.
Yes.
And that changes. Each time that there's a curriculum renewal, approximately every 5 years or 6 years in this state, there's a change and a shift in what kids need to know and be able to do.
So Ben, are both of these then relying on writing? Both of these areas that we just talked about, is the math modeling also a writing expression, or is it something
Primarily,
different?
but there are simulations in drag and drop. By drag and drop, I mean they give you a problem and you can drag certain sections into putting it into a thoughtful response.
They have to be very computer literate.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
And-
so is that, oh, go ahead. No, go ahead. So I did have a question from before. I know one of the reasons towards going to the Common Core was being able to compare across states, right? So do we feel like we're able to do that at this point in time?
So previously, when we were part of PARC, we had 3 metrics that came up. There was the district, the state, and the national average, because that was part of a consortium across the country. Now that we have owned the assessment ourselves, we've developed our own, our ability to reference other states is pretty limited. We can do some correlations, but because we write our own test and it's ours only, our ability to compare to other states is difficult.
When you say we, you mean Colorado?
Colorado, yes.
The state.
Just making sure.
Yeah.
It's Colorado.
I use we pretty liberally here.
Wouldn't it be great to have our chamber members and outside members kind of be familiar with just the difficulty of some
I
of
would love
these?
for them all to sit in a room and take the test.
So I have a question that we may not be able to get to tonight because I think our time is almost up. Which is, when I look at these 2 areas that CMAS shows us are our lowest, it seems like to me they probably somewhat build on the 2 that are higher, because those seem to be content. Like, you have to know the content to be able to do those other 2 areas, is that correct?
You do need to know the content, but it's, I think what Matt was alluding to is, we have, if you think about traditional math being fluency and computation and just really paying attention to the traditional algorithm, our kids are doing really well with that. They understand the content and they understand procedural fluency. Where they're struggling is being able to explain why they can do that, why it works in why the algorithm works, why a model of a different approach might work. So they do understand the content, but does that make sense?
It does, and so what I'm looking for is if these are areas that we know we have more room for growth, the curriculum resources that we're considering for math. I can't help it, it's always on my mind. Do we have evidence that shows that these 8 things are particularly good at improving those 2 areas, since we know that's where we need to focus, or?
So when we shifted to Common Core, I would say yes is the short answer. When we shifted to Common Core, it wasn't as readily explicit in the standards that the shift was to this, away from just procedural fluency and a deeper understanding at a conceptual level. So as our textbooks have aligned with Common Core, you're seeing the practices that are needed to go deeper for students. And then as we've shifted again into 2020, we're seeing an even much more explicit call out in our own standards of that conceptual basis and along with the textbooks. So absolutely, I would say yes.
So I'm guessing that you could provide us something, just like something on paper that says, this is how this resource would address these couple areas. We know that it improves because of, we did this research study, or we compared to a neighboring district who's doing really well or doing better in these 2 areas, and we've seen that they're using these resources that have them available. I'm just looking for a little bit more concrete. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then also just wondering, and not expecting you to have an answer, but I'm guessing, and you all know exactly, we measure our math achievement and growth probably with other instruments too, lots of them. Is there anything consistent across the district, or that we could also pull from to
Yes.
say we see areas of growth because of these other assessments and these resources? Those are the sorts of things I'm looking for.
And so we do, for grades K through 8, they do take iReady Math, which iReady Math is correlated very strongly with Common Core standards and this assessment. So they have that additional data set, which is administered 3 times during the year and has instructional resources that support that instruction that's tied to that assessment. So we do have that additional assessment available to us. And not only that, but that assessment allows us to drill down even deeper than these global, down to the actual standards themselves to see how kids are performing against standard on items that are very similar to what they see on this. So it's another valuable data set. And that's more instructional than it is summative, because they actually get resources that say students who are scoring in this range or have these deficiencies, these are some ready-made strategies that you can use to them right now.
That'd be great.
It helps us to identify the gap, and I remember vividly the board saying, I think it was from President Ray, okay, we've invested this X amount of money in iReady, we expect all of our schools to use it. What percentage of our schools are using iReady now, Erica?
I would say 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our neighborhood schools are 100%, and we're getting more and more charter schools to join iReady because they're seeing the value of this idea that the assessment itself is aligned between the standards and the state summative assessment. So more of them have been joining as well.
And that helps us get at the academic gaps that a couple of directors have asked about. So we know what those gaps are. Our job is to first and foremost improve the teaching and learning, great teachers here, and give them the requisite PD and the resources.
So when we triangulate the data, so when we see this data and then the iReady data, are we coming to the similar conclusions that the areas that our kids struggle with more is the notion of explaining their thinking?
Yeah, and we can actually go one more layer to that and say there are specific standards that we can identify that not just explaining, but there are specific standards within mathematics that, you know, appear to be patterns in certain buildings. But that really is a building level conversation because there's, you know, the 3 parts that Dr. Tucker has talked about. There's also what's actually being delivered at the school. What are the expectations beyond just the assessment data? It's a great conversation. It's part of the job that I'm doing.
And thanks for that expenditure again. I was shocked when I came here that the state does not provide that type of analysis, drilling down from the standard to the grade level. In other states, they're called grade level indicators, but here, grade level expectations. If you're going to hold districts to that high level of accountability, shouldn't we know where those gaps are? And our state does not provide that. And my heart goes out to those districts that are not able to afford MAP, measures of academic progress, and iReady. So again, thank the board and the community for providing us that type of assessment.
One of the pieces that I was recognizing as well is the two areas, even that we have some areas for growth, our greatest areas for growth are very expressive language dominant. And so I was looking at our English language learners in relation to the math scores on CMAS. And our English language learners, it indicates that our ELL kids are approaching the standard. So that speaks to that program and the trend in that program, because these two categories and areas for greatest concern are pretty language rich. So it's interesting to see that, I mean, when you're looking at trends and when you're looking at celebrations or looking at things to improve and look at, that's an area of celebration according to this data.
Are we purposefully using the term Common Core standards over Colorado academic standards?
We're using Colorado academic standards. Common Core is thrown out. That sheet up there was just a historical look at assessments in Colorado over the last 15 plus years.
So it is our preference
Yeah,
to
it is our
really
preference.
speak to the Colorado academic standards as
Because
we're talking.
It allows us, the Douglas County School District, to fashion, even the Common Core was just a curriculum framework of what kids should know and be able to do. States and school districts could take those standards and teach the way that best fit their individual students.
That's my preference as well.
Yep.
Okay.
And
Just
the
making
clarity of
sure.
language for us has been powerful, because prior to the state taking on that exam, we were part of PARC. So we had to speak two languages. We had to speak Colorado academic standards along with Common Core state standards. Now that we own the content, we have alignment between our own standards and the items that are on that test, which is certainly helpful for us, just from a language standpoint.
Can I just ask one other kind of question that's always just resonating in my mind? People who write the test, Pearson, have curriculum that they also write. So that curriculum obviously aligns to the test. Have we considered Pearson mathematics?
Yeah, it's one of our choices. It's our division.
And we've also considered the iReady test itself has a math textbook that's associated with it, so that's another choice that's on our menu as well.
I mean, data throughout the state and actually throughout the country, if you look at it critically and you look at the alignment of the assessment, I'm not saying you teach to the test, there's a little bit of different conversation to have there, so please don't beat me up about that. But if you look at the alignment of what the Pearson assessment persons who write the test and then the curriculum that they put together to address the test, it naturally makes sense to me to think about that alignment.
So not to beat a dead horse with the Colorado academic standards, but the reason I kind of brought that up is because when we're trying to help the opt-out numbers go down, I think when we speak to Common Core standards, that like raises anxiety and kind of feeds into that opt-out. And so I think the more we can be very careful with our language, make sure we're talking about Colorado academic standards and that our state has developed these standards will help with that problem.
I also want to be careful though, and Erica, correct me if I'm wrong, the Colorado academic standards encompasses Common Core. I mean, it's not like we've got Colorado academic standards in Common Core that they don't
I'd say
see
they
eye to eye.
align, they align.
I say they've integrated them into the academic standards. I think you can actually tease out Common Core. So I agree with you. I think Common Core has a trigger for our community and for other people, but I also don't want to be deceptive in saying we don't address Common Core because our academic standards do.
I wasn't saying that. I was
Okay.
just saying I would use the term Colorado academic standards when you're talking about our standards.
Right.
And when asked, I would say, yeah, they align, but I wouldn't lead
It's more than
with
aligned,
that
right.
term.
And the state has used very specific language for that. Instead of adopting the Common Core standards, they've adapted them. And so that's the clarity of language, the connecting between the two, that when you're speaking of Common Core and you're speaking of Colorado academic standards, they adapted the Common Core standards for our state. That's how they refer to that.
Would you identify which curriculum resource aligns with Pearson?
Envision.
Pardon?
Envision is a Pearson product.
Yeah, and we had a great conversation with two of our directors today, and each one of those resources comes with an evaluative form. And we discussed that if that resource is not aligned with the Colorado academic content standards, that resource will not be purchased.
So we're doing that now for those 8, or
No, we've already done that.
You've already done that.
Had a
It wouldn't have been on the list if that
That's
hadn't
correct.
been done.
We've had a
I just wanted
vetting
to-
process, but as you pointed out, vetting looks different from place to place.
Wasn't it?
So board directors, we are at the 6:30 point, so I just want to check in. Do we have any burning questions that we need to have addressed? Okay, Elizabeth, go for
I
it.
can't believe I'm gonna be the one to ask the equity question. If you go through if you go through the costs of the available curriculum resources, the two that we just mentioned that are associated with the tests, if I'm doing numbers correctly, are more expensive than the others that are available.
Shocking.
And I just want that to be a piece that is considered when we are talking about equity, if all of our kids are going to be taking the same tests.
And that was a trigger for some of our people to purchase less expensive.
Other, which then relates, it goes right back to problematic. It doesn't align, it's not specific, but resources
Great
expensive,
observation.
yeah.
So I
It's
just
more than
want,
an observation. I think what Elizabeth is wondering is kind of what's the action around that? You know, what are we doing to level the playing field so that we don't continue this cycle of the cheap materials go to the kids that need it the most,
Well,
right? I mean,
so I think, that lead to my question is, we previously have a wonderful discussions about the curriculum resources. So looking at what we are seeing today, could you comment that your approach of the curriculum resources will actually make the whole situations better, moving forward, and how we could create the equitability between different schools? Because right now, everybody is using their own stuff. Some of them are really outdated because we are trying to save some money. We have a variety of math program right now. It's probably 2016 or something like that. So can you comment on that? How would that, how we could make us, a stronger school district?
you asked me 5 questions, so I.
I know.
So what's the first, I'm sorry, Director Lund, what's the first question?
My specific one is, with the new curriculum resources that you're proposing, could it help or hurt our future performance?
When we look at our achievement, and which we've taken a very close look at the data. And we know that we're not happy. We've done a good job, but we're not happy.
Right.
When you're not hitting the mark where you want to be, there's a misalignment of the curriculum. And using curriculum as this huge umbrella term. There's a misalignment with the written curriculum, and I'm really pleased with the board's understanding of the written curriculum being the Colorado academic content standards when we start to look, plus, so that's one part of it, plus resources that we're asking for, plus any other curriculum materials that teachers are creating through PLCs. They're even creating formative assessments, all those types of things. And aligning that with the PD. I know Director Chomcho Shore and all of you have asked about, what PD are you giving our teachers? Today, in our meeting with all of our district elementary principals and leaders, only 2 folks raised their hand when they said that they had, and this is no different across the country. When you start to look at elementary math teachers, our elementary teachers are generalists. They can teach everything. We have very, very talented teachers here who can teach a lot of things. But we do know there's a higher level of affinity in teaching the subject with our teachers who have a math degree. Very few math teachers with math degrees are teaching math across the country at the elementary level, certainly not at a level that we deserve. So when we provide these resources and equally important PD, because we can have all the resources in the world, but if our teachers don't have this degree of affinity, this degree of comfort that comes from professional development, ongoing, real-time professional development, then we're not going to make the progress we're going to make. Through the vetting process, one of the questions was, does the resource come with free PD? And how much PD do we need to add on to it? And then the last part, we will be able to address the assessed curriculum. We spent the whole night talking about that. So the answer is yes. When you look at any school district across America, and I'll put my reputation on it, when they're not hitting that mark, there's a misalignment in one of those 3 areas of curriculum.
So just, I want to wrap up. I don't know that we really addressed Elizabeth's question that she brought up in terms of what are we doing to make sure that our students that need the greatest alignment, if you will, of resource are getting that and not having to use cost as their filter when they're thinking about that, so.
Well, this is the first step in purchasing an aligned curriculum for every school, every neighborhood school in our district. Assuring that there's robust PD and that Erica and her folks are going out into buildings and ensuring that the curriculum is taught to a high level of fidelity. As we talk today, many of our PTAs and PTOs may want to go over and beyond and buy additional resources. That still could happen, but now we have an opportunity across the board to bring equity to each one of our schools, each one of our neighborhood students, and providing a fully aligned, a fully vetted curriculum.
So I think we should close here. I think we've set the stage for some conversation we're going to have at our next meeting on the 21st. I want to just thank staff. This is exactly what we have needed to really hone in on. You've given us an additional link tonight that I think was critical for us to understand the reason for where we are. But I know this is a lot of work, Erica, on your department especially. I know we've been grilling you with questions, and I just want to especially just acknowledge you, your calm demeanor, your patience with us. Truly, this is not us questioning whether this is the direction we should be going. It's truly wanting us to gain a depth of understanding, so we're walking the journey with you. So just hang in there with us as we continue to ask our questions, so that we're making sure we're making informed decisions on behalf of our 68,000. So again, Matt, thank you also for tonight. Just again, great insights, and I love how you're able to make things that are very complex make sense. So thank you for helping us with that. And Dr. Tucker, again, thank you for the leadership, and we're looking forward to continuing down this road in terms of focus on student learning. So thanks so much. All right, have a good evening.
Thanks.